Thanks again for joining, and we will start off with you, Ilias, giving a little bit of insights to the EU's digital sustainability agenda.
Right. So thank you for having me. The intro that I would like to introduce is basically what is the nexus between sustainability and digital, and then we actually focus on the trade as a third part of this triangle. So the question is, what is the net impact of digitalization on environment and climate? That's a big question that people struggle with. Okay, so we have the world is kind of divided between the solutionists and the pollutionists. When I talk to heads of environmental agencies and I ask them, so what do you think it is? Majority thinks we are more of a pollution than a solution. When I talk to industry and to specialized experts, they say, yes, the potential is much bigger on the solution than on the pollution, but that solution is not realized. So we still talk potential. So in numbers, the carbon footprint has been estimated somewhere between 2 and 4, and depends how you define digital, because digital is a moving target. So let's say 3% is the carbon footprint. So it's not as big as other major industries, but it's bigger than aviation already, and it's growing. What is more worrying is not only the electricity demand that's growing very fast, especially now with the AI and data centers running AI, and maybe Natalie will tell us more. It's, for me, more the materials, because it's rare materials. And those materials, the energy efficiency is in the interest of the private sector, so they will do the most to minimize their bills. So I don't see that we need to do too much on as public sector, although we just published the KPIs on what data centers, green data centers mean. We are working on what green telecoms mean. We are measuring e-waste. I think is the materials where there is not alignment yet between private and public sector. So there's too much e-waste. Still, the devices, the digital devices, are not reparable, remanufacturable, and durable as it should be. So that is the footprint. The question is, what do we do with the handprint? So handprint is a new keyword for those that don't know it, on what is the positive impact of digital on environment and climate. It has been estimated, and there are kind of top-down studies that, yeah, digital, if used properly, can cut up to 20% of total emissions. Okay, so you can compare 3% footprint, 20% potential, but it's a potential. What is the reality? And that reality is difficult to measure. So what we have done, so I personally have done, we created something called Green Digital Coalition, and we developed a method to measure. But we cannot measure at large per technology. We can measure per ICT solution deployed at a place in a given geography with a given context. So that methodology has been published last month. It's open public for everybody to use. And actually shows, as we do the calculations, that yes, that potential is there, but if governed, developed, and used properly. So the potential of ICT to go into rebound effect is big. So people have to have a smart way of governing the ICT in a way that it doesn't, while it starts as a good solution, that it doesn't go astray. So in summary, the big question that we need to pose to private and public sector is the following. Digitalization, traditionally for the last 30 years, served the economic dimension of sustainability. Sustainability has 3 dimensions. During the COVID, we realized how good also it can be the social. And when you look at developments in e-gov and e-health and inclusion, digital can do a lot for social, although it creates a lot of problems of inequalities and access to digital. It has its own social issues and skills. It can help the social one. And people are struggling with that for, let's say, 10 years at least. The environmental dimension of sustainability, the third dimension, has been completely ignored for decades. It resurfaced with the Commission's priority for green digital transition, so it became kind of a mainstream issue, but has still not made it to be realizable, concrete, and measurable and actionable. So it still stays at the level of narratives. And if I had to choose where digital can do the most, and that, so you have a competing sectors where digitalization is already active: energy, transport, agriculture, construction, buildings, manufacturing. If I had to choose, the biggest impact of digitalization would be to make our economy circular. And that's where trade comes in. And that's where the digital product passport comes in, because it's kind of a champion of a digital for circular area. Because non-circular economy is the main driver of the triple crisis. So because we are running the economy the way we do, we have the triple crisis: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And they are as important as climate change, the other two. And the driver of that is the non-circularity of our economy. So where digital can really make a big difference is that. And then we can enter directly from that to the trade policies and how that can help also the trade. So that's his intro.
Very good. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Elias. Lots of questions come immediately up on the policy implications and the fact that we are still at that stage. But before we delve into our discussion into any further, let me next anyone else who is looking into this, as said, from the consumer, from the demand perspective, from the consumer's side. So floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Maybe before we kick off, let me maybe introduce what Euroconsumers is. Maybe not all of you are acquainted with it. It's actually an integrated group of 5 consumer organizations, national ones. Most of you might know Testancoop, Testasha here in Belgium, also based at Testancoop. But we also have organizations in Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Brazil, all membership based. And as such, we represent more than 1.5 million consumers. Our European organizations, including Testasha, are also a member of the umbrella of BUG, which you might also be acquainted with. But if you have a look at our logo and a look at our website, you will see it comes with a tagline: empower people, improve the market. And that's not just good branding. It's really who we are, what we do. It's the mission and the vision. It catches in a very short sentence what we stand for. So because if we empower people, we believe they can push for innovations and opportunities that meets their own challenges. And if we improve markets, they can and they should deliver on trustworthy technology, on the green transition, circular economy, and affordable goods. Of course, empower people, improve the market. It doesn't stop at the borders of Euroconsumers. It doesn't stop at the borders of Europe. It's global, and it very much matches our vision on trade. Global trade is extremely important for consumers. It has brought them lots of benefits in the past decades, and for sure also for businesses for that matter. And it should keep on doing this. So needless to say, as Euroconsumers, we're very much in favor of free trade and open markets, as long as it is fair and also sustainable. And let me maybe come back first to the fair part. It's extremely important to have fair trade, but we have to admit that with the recent developments, very much focused on strengthening European businesses, it has triggered some concerns, or at least a bit of discomfort. Of course, trade needs to be fair, whether we import or export for that matter. But we cannot get rid of the idea that we are balancing a very thin line between fair trade and actually protectionism, and that the rightful concerns for this fairness and geopolitical considerations can be at least misused for mere internal consideration, or even just local considerations and local businesses. And this is something that we really need to be careful about, that we avoid this kind of misuse. It would not be good for our internal market. It would not be good for businesses, and it will sure not be good for consumers either. And you might think, as a consumer organization, why do you care so much about this? Well, because trade matters. It's not just a strange thing up in the air, alienated, far away from our benefit. It impacts markets, so it impacts consumers, and that's why we need to get it right. But unfortunately, we see there is sometimes a bit of a mismatch between Europe's internal policies and its external trade policies. Now, a recent study commissioned by Brugge, and I have a feeling some of you might be familiar with this, because also the VEB was involved, but a recent study showed that Europe's trade policy does not always matches the ambitions of the Green Deal. And just to give two examples, eco-design, extremely important for circular economy, to make sure that we have longer lasting products that can be recovered, repaired, reused and recycled. Or, for example, digital electric mobility and requirements for recycled content of batteries. These are two extremely important pieces, and it shows that the WTO rules are not always fully coherent with these ambitions and with the Green Deal. And it's not merely about a mismatch. It can go further. It can also put up barriers in digital trade. First of all, let me say it's extremely good that Europe has included e-commerce rules in trade policies to overview the digital economy. It goes with data flows, data protections, but also provisions on source codes. And there it can become tricky. We have recent European flagship legislation like the AI Act, the right to repair, eco-design, all very important. But if trade policies put limits to access to source codes or other digital tools, it can become extremely important for our authorities to actually check whether, for example, a product can, or the software could be updated and a product can last longer. So it becomes really concrete in that way, also for consumers. And that's why it's absolutely crucial that we make trade policy right. So it doesn't put up barriers to the ambition that we have also as Europe on sustainability and digitization. But enough about what goes wrong or can go wrong, because there's a lot that can go right as well. And it's not because I started with some points of critical points that we're not fully convinced that, digital tools, digital trades can be a boost for sustainability. So I guess you can count on us a bit more as the solutionist. Already, I think 5 years ago, we published actually a paper, AI for Consumers in the Green Transition, based on a survey, a large consumer survey, and also showed that consumers are asking for this kind of innovation coming from digital tools. But to bring it back to the trade context, maybe two examples, and Ilias already mentioned it, the digital product passport, in our opinion, it will be a game changer, because it will improve how we can trace products who are entering in our market, and with, by sharing sustainable product information like, on lifespan, repairs, repairability, it can really boost this circular economy both inside and outside Europe. And maybe another example, imagine that we would have a digital system in place that could improve the customs checks done at our border on safe and non-compliant products. Imagine there would be a system where customs authorities would be able to share their checks and flag the unsafe products. It sounds like a no-brainer, but it's not there yet. But at least it would take a huge burden from their shoulders and really improve, the safety of sustainable and digital products entering into our market. And that's why, these are very two concrete examples that have a direct impact on consumers' lives, on the products and the services that we need on sustainability. So that's why we need to make it right, not putting up barriers, but actually use trade policy also to boost sustainability and digitization in Europe. And maybe to wrap it up, I'd like to come back to the beginning, to where we started on empower people, improve the market. Mm-hmm. The examples I gave, I hope they showcase that trade really matters for consumers. It's not just about businesses, it's also about consumers. And it makes you wonder, where are consumers in this entire trade narrative, trade negotiations, trade deals? And it doesn't give me much pleasure to say, well, basically nowhere. And that's actually baffling because consumers are part of a market. It's not just businesses, they are part of the market, whether it's European or it's global. And if they are part of the market, they should be part of trade policy. It impacts their lives, but they can also impact trade for the better. And also here, I mean, recent developments, for example, with the letter report, I mean, it makes me not, it doesn't really convince me that it will change for the better in the future. It's very much about creating Europe's resilience, rightfully so, agree 200%. But that's more than just about strengthening business. It should be about strengthening our market, and consumers are a crucial part of that. So if you want to do it right, also in trade policies, if you want to keep it sane, competitive, balanced, you will need to have equally empowered consumers. You will need consumers to play their role, and you will need to let them play their role also in trade policies. So that was just as an introduction.
Thank you very much. Powerful approach, excellent. I think the references to circular economy, to digital passport, certainly are resonating with Elias, and that's why we also have here a public policy manager from Amazon. So, Natalie, what are your thoughts, continuing from those of Els?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to start by actually echoing a lot of what Els was saying, both at the beginning and at the end of your intervention. Just in the current political context, where we're seeing a lot of trends toward protectionism. I think also with the letter reports and the upcoming Draghi reports. And it's true that from the perspective of a business that is based outside of the EU, of course, it's concerning to think that the EU would start to look more inwards. And so a general call from us has always been to make sure that we're making the most and exploiting the opportunities that international trade bring, particularly with partners, for instance, the US, that are like-minded overall. And we have the example of the IRA, of course, that has really boosted sustainability in the US and the EU's response to that with the Net Zero Industry Act. But now it's important that we kind of stop competing and actually try to work together. And I think technology really plays a huge role in this. But maybe diving a bit more concretely into the topic of today's conversation. So as you mentioned at the beginning, Harry, there are three pillars that we're looking at. One is digital, one is trade, and the third is sustainability. And Amazon, small introduction in case needed, but we're an e-commerce company and one of the biggest e-commerce companies in the world. So we basically built our business on digital trades. So of course, this is an important issue to us. And then when we speak about sustainability, this has really become part of our DNA since 2019, because we founded and we're the first signatory to the Climate Pledge, which is a pledge that companies have taken to be net zero by 2040, so 10 years faster than the Paris Agreement. And since we've signed in 2019, over 400 other companies have joined, and we have quite a few major European brands in that effort. So it's nice to see that companies are really trying to decarbonize faster than what's legally required. I think that's the main message we want to send. And basically through this work, so through being a digital trade company and working on sustainability, we started to see areas where the three of them can really work together. And I think echoing a lot of the opening remarks by Elias, we actually see that digitalization can be used as a tool to support sustainability goals. And so I wanted to maybe give two examples of this, one where it's working from our perspective and one where it could work better. So maybe starting with the positive. So we see a role for retailers, and particularly in the digital sphere, so online retailers, in trying to help customers see more sustainable products when they're shopping online. So very simply, you're probably aware of the EU's efforts to regulate green claims. So the idea that companies make sustainability claims about their products, but we need to make sure that these are properly substantiated and that they're based on facts. And what we did is, when we were looking at how to try and show more sustainable products to our customers, we were faced with all the claims that all the products that are sold on Amazon are making. And so to try to sift through these claims and identify the ones that are actually correct, we thought the best way of doing this was to base ourselves on credible third-party certifications. So it's very aligned with what the Green Claims Proposal is looking at. And so we set up a program to look at certifications that were on the market and to see which ones had good governance systems in place, have good methodologies, are looking at full LCAs, are looking at trade-offs. And we identified out of over 400 different certifications. We identified 40 that we consider really to be the top best in class based on these criteria. And these include, as you can imagine, the EU Eco Label, Nordic Swan, but also some private labels such as the FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council, and Carbon Trust. And what we do with our program is just to put a small badge on products that have certification, that is a credible certification. And the idea behind this is that in the digital world, consumers, when they're looking at the Amazon website, so browsing through different products, they have a very short attention span. I think this is a well-known fact. And they really look for quality, so the reviews, how many stars a product has, for the price, of course, that's one of the key factors. And thirdly, for the speed of delivery. So that's what our statistics show. But we've included sustainability as well as one of the factors that they'll see up front, because we've also seen that customers actually like to see this type of information. And we have actually seen that it has driven customers to look more at the products that have the badge, so that have a third-party certification. And we've seen a 10% increase since we launched the program of views on pages that have this badge. So it is actually very successful. And I think the main message is that digital tools can really help show products that are more sustainable to customers. And the way that we do this, again, is working through credible third-party certifications to ensure that it's not greenwashing. I think that's also a very important element. So that's one example where digital has really helped. And then maybe one example where digital could help further, and I think this will be homework for Elias and his team, but one of the big complexities, I think, particularly in the context of the letter reports looking at single market barriers, and then the upcoming competitiveness report by Draghi, is extended producer responsibility schemes. And here, for SMEs in particular, we have 250,000 European SMEs that sell on Amazon, so it's quite a significant basis. When they're trying to sell from one EU country to another EU country, as you know, they need to register in all the relevant EPR schemes in each country. So currently in the EU, we have over 80 different schemes in place. And I think in France alone, there are about 27 EPR schemes. And depending on what you're selling, you may need to register in multiple schemes in multiple countries. And this gets really complex if you're a small business, just understand what you need to do, how you can do it. And then, of course, there's a price tag that comes with this. But the main point is also that EPR has been very successful in terms of boosting the whole principles of eco-modulation, so making sure that manufacturers think about designing their products in a more sustainable way. So we were trying to think of ways in which we can keep the eco-modulation principles and keep the EPR schemes, but also make it easier for SMEs to comply. And so what we're suggesting, and again, this comes back to your team, is to try and just add a digital layer on top of this. So to see whether using some of the principles of the digital product passports or digitalization efforts that the Commission has done, whether as an SME, you could, for instance, have an online platform where you would log in, fill in a form explaining what your product does, explaining how it's made, so all the materials within it, probably going into a lot of detail. And this form would automatically register you in each of the schemes across Europe and would just tell you how much you need to pay in order to meet your EPR requirements. And this is one, for us, this would be a very simple solution to make sure that there's higher compliance with EPR schemes, so that also products coming from outside the EU, so that we're selling on Amazon, but in other marketplaces too, are complying. But also it would increase eco-modulation fees. It would give the possibility for member states to continue developing new schemes where we see that these would be useful, but it would definitely reduce the burden for SMEs and sellers. I think I'll leave it there. 2 thoughts.
Very good. No, thanks very much. These are very concrete, and again, resonating very much against what just Alice and Elias both were mentioning early on. So let's then, before engaging in a further discussion, let's zoom actually a little bit outwards, and we go to caller you online. So how does this look like in the discussions so far from the viewpoint of WTO law and the kind of more from the international lawyer standpoint and the trade policy or trade law angle?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. Can you hear me all?
Very well.
Okay, perfect. This is a discussion that's very exciting because even us sort of as researchers, I'm doing research on digital trade, but even, you know, in the trade community, sustainability and trade, I think just really gives a huge advantage. And of course, on the more sort of practical level, you know, you are the experts. But essentially, I think we shouldn't forget that WTO law and including the WTO agreement, really mentions sustainable development as, in the preamble. So it's really baked in within the system. But what I will walk you through in the few minutes is just what laws apply currently with regards to digital trade. And also, if we can have time, just that relationship between, policies and WTO law as to how they would be, considered in the regulatory framework. So the WTO law, as you know, it's sort of it's universal, regulates all trade. It's been enforced, since 1995. There's a high level of legalization, meaning that there is dispute settlement. Unfortunately, as you all know, the dispute settlement system of the WTO is struggling a bit, but there are still very important disputes that are coming through the system. And of course, traditionally, there have been, environmental related, sustainable development related disputes, like shrimp and gasoline, et cetera, et cetera. So really, this is a forum that is not a stranger to sustainability issues. But zooming into the more digital issues is that, unfortunately, it's not an adapted legal system, meaning that the laws that apply to digital trade are very fragmented. We have the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which regulates goods, trade in goods. So it could be the devices and the automated cars, et cetera, et cetera. We also have an agreement, which is the General Agreement on Trade and Services, GATS, which probably is the most relevant to digital trade and digital services. So I will zoom in a little bit on that. But obviously, there's the TRIPS on IP, and there's various joint initiatives on services domestic regulation, which, as I said to you, is very fragmented and does not deal with digital trade in a comprehensive manner. So there is an opportunity there for the trade rules to upgrade themselves to trade law, 2.0 or 4.0, to regulate e-commerce digital trade in a more, comprehensive manner. I will give you an update, though. So essentially in the GATS, the way that it works is that members would have undertaken different types of commitments under various services, sectors. For example, computer-related services that, covers software implementation, data processing, database services. There's telecommunications, that's quite obvious. There's audiovisual services that covers, cultural products like movies, and music, et cetera, et cetera. So it would be like, companies like Spotify. And essentially now, because everything is, supplied on a cross-border basis or can be supplied on a cross-border basis, you can imagine that the GATS would apply to everything that can be provided online. So whether it be legal services, et cetera, et cetera. And, there is sort of a provision that says, to the extent that something that a member has made a commitment with regards to a certain sector that is provided online, depending data, for example, the data flows connected to that, all of those commitments fall into what would be, the member's obligations under the GATS. So what would be those obligations? Shortly to say, the most relevant one would be market access. So basically saying once you commit to a certain sector, you cannot block market access in any way, except if you had put that in your schedule, right? Because this is all committed sectors that are on the GATT schedule. And obviously, some of the relevant principles are discrimination. Of course, we have MFN, and we also have national treatment, which are obviously very important aspect of trade in all aspects, including digital services and digital goods, as we see going forward. I would say probably the most relevant initiative that's happening right now at the WTO is the negotiations of the Joint Initiative on Electronic Commerce. It started back in 2017 as an initiative. Negotiations started in 2019. And right now we're seeing sort of the end tail of these negotiations. Unfortunately, as of late last year, there have been very sort of key provisions that have been removed due to the US's, I guess, reassessment of its policy space. So what is not in the WTO's Joint Initiative on Electronic Commerce is data flows, is source code, and what data localization. So those are things that would not be regulated at the WTO level once this e-commerce initiative comes into play. But let me just give you a taste of what is in there. So there are provisions enabling e-commerce like digital transactions, digital trade facilitations, logistics, e-authentication, e-signatures, e-invoicing, et cetera, There's provisions on customs duties, on e-transmissions, which I'll talk about very quickly right now, on open government data, and then there's consumer protection, privacy protection, cybersecurity, and then various provisions on development, which is also very interesting. Evolution in an e-commerce agreement. So this speaks to sort of the sustainable development, but that goes to the social aspects of it, special and differential treatment and issues of access, et cetera. So just to wrap up quickly, I would like to talk about what is probably not in there, but what is in the exceptions. So essentially, members can adopt measures that they seem necessary to protect whatever public policy goal that they wish. And of course, in WTO law, we have, public morals or public order. There's animal, human, and plant protection, which is basically to go into the worst environments. And then in the GATS, there is a privacy specific provision. So essentially, if the measure is sort of, adapted and it's applied equally, any WTO member, including the EU, of course, could invoke an exception. And more we see security exceptions being invoked for various things that would not have traditionally been called, security exception type of topics. And then I'll just wrap up on the customs duty moratorium, which is something that, unfortunately, I guess for the trade community and the business community is in threat. So essentially, this customs duty moratorium is an agreement that WTO members had back in 1998 to not impose customs duties on electronic transmissions. And these electronic transmissions would include e-books, musical download, streaming. It could be movies, it could be software, games, et cetera. And as of this year at the Ministerial Conference in 13 in Abu Dhabi, members have essentially agreed that in the next Ministerial Conference, this rule will be lifted, meaning that WTO members could potentially, if they want, apply customs duties on electronic transmissions. There's been, numerous studies to show, the devastating impact of this, and it will be interesting to see how it works in practice. But this is obviously a rule, that was really hard and fast, the WTO law, that will not be available to the e-commerce or to the digital trade community going forward. But essentially, there is a lot of scope on, sort of the goods aspect of it. I think there could be an agreement on, the e-goods agreements to assist with sustainability issues. There's a lot of talks at the WTO, but so far there's nothing concrete. So thank you so much for your time. I look forward to engaging with you in the Q&A session.
Thanks very much, Colette, for raising issues which are then a bit looking at it from a different angle and indeed from a legal perspective of WTO or what is currently being legislated or ruled upon and how the developments there are also facing some of these geopolitical trends which we see elsewhere as well, as you mentioned. So we can see how this resonates. But let me next do this. Let's do a small round of interactions here between the speakers. So just would you have any thoughts on each other's perhaps presentations or issues that were raised that you would like to comment on? Natalie, go ahead.
Just
Yes,
very
sure.
quickly, because I wanted to come back to some of Ilias's comments on the environmental impact of digital. I think it's a very interesting point because it's also for us when we're trying to advocate for AI or for digital solutions. But one of the arguments we often make is that it does actually help at least displace emissions because it's true in some ways you're creating more in one area, although you're reducing some in another. And I agree that it's very hard to actually measure what the balance is, and that'll be a really important element going forward. So it's just a remark that it's very interesting to hear that you're trying to develop methodologies to assess this, because I would assume that it's very complex also because there are so many different elements that need to be taken into account in terms of also the kind of the economic productivity rates that digital brings. But then I think it must be a very hard calculation to make. So I'd be curious to hear a little bit about what went into that thought process, and
Yes,
if you're finding it useful.
it is very complex. It's very complex. So that's why we did it we will do it in 2 stages. So we do something for a digital solution like a building management, energy management system, or precision farming in a very specific geography, very specific setting. That can be done in a way that we calculate the LCA. So what is the footprint of a solution to be put in place? Because there is embedded emissions in the manufacturing and emissions in using it. So that is the footprint. And then we look at what is the benefit, how much energy actually the building saves. And with a very simple IT system in a building, you have almost guaranteed 10 to 15% energy efficiency. And if you put that in public buildings in a big city, it's millions. It's huge. It pays for itself very quickly. And you can do it in a week to install it. Precision farming is more complex because there are the governance of who is actually having the gadgets in there. Is it the farmer or is it a specialized company using it? So it's not so clear if there is a quick turnover. But in ICT solutions, we have the methodology. The problem is that it requires data on the baseline. It requires data on the device's footprint, and it requires good monitoring of the benefits. So the complexity of data acquisition is still an obstacle. So I'm trying to see if we can simplify to bare minimum without sacrificing the science behind it. What is difficult is to go and say, are all the data centers positive or negative for them? You know, the infrastructure elements outside of that context of a solution. So all the telecoms, are they eventually green or not? There, all we can do is to make sure that we count correctly what exactly is the footprint, and then start extrapolating from these ICT solutions. Then you can say, is the data centers in Netherlands, do they have overall positive or negative? So that you have to actually measure. What are they used for? Are they used for smart city solutions? Are they used for precision farming? Are they used for buildings? And from few of the buildings and precision farming solutions, you extrapolate the volume that you expect them to work. And then you say, yes, this is the enablement, this is the footprint, let's do that. That work is now starting. So I have a study, I want to go into infrastructural impact, not solution impact, but it's even more complex. Okay, because there are a lot of assumptions about extrapolating this and that. Okay, so whoever is interested, the methodologies are there. They can contact me and I can, do a deep dive into this, but it's very complex. And at the end of the day, it's the governance of that solution not to go into rebound effects. Because, for example, in many cities, there is something called mobility as a service. So there are many cars like Uber type of, but very localized. And it's a service company that says, sign contract with me, I get you from A to B under, so fast. The cost of a mobility as a service is kind of half of owning a car. It is much cleaner because 1/20th of the cars can actually do the job, moving hundreds of thousands of people, So it's cleaner air, it's less energy, it's less materials. So it looks perfect, but it can go very wrong because then these kind of services can cannibalize public transport. These kind of services, if they do not incentivize people not to own a car, will sit in addition to those hundreds of thousands of cars in the city. So it's like additional CO2 and materials. And if people start abusing it, putting objects in it, it can go a nightmare scenario. So again, you see, if you want to put such place, you have to incentivize people not to buy a car. You have to make it complementary to the public service. You have to forbid certain behaviors. Then you have a chance to be positive. So it's not just throwing IT at something that it will deliver green.
Right.
And that narrative we see all the time. Oh, just put 5G in Brussels and the world will be greener again.
Yeah.
That's not so simple.
And I guess that's also where the policies come in, and that's when the policies come in for the purposes of increasing the sustainability of the things that we do. But then the trade implications are actually on the table because different regions may still deal with these issues in a slightly different way. So the objective may be the same, to manage the complexity, to make sure that you get the sustainability benefits.
Right.
But how? And then if the means of doing that differ, we have, let's say, unnecessary barriers.
By design, I'm actually criticizing my own house. By design, the Green Deal legislations, green claims, deforestation, wastewater, you name it, climate target, all that, the Green Deal was like a mother of all legislation, is pregnant every month. I mean, people are so overwhelmed by the legislation and the reporting requirements. It's just a shock in the market. But I must say that the use of ICT tools for simpler reporting, what you just mentioned about DPR scheme registration for SMEs, machine readability of our implementing acts, it still is a lot of challenges there. Okay, so the ICT, so the digital component in green is very weak. Vice versa, if you look at all the acts we issued, the sustainability aspects of Chips Act, Data Act, Cybersecurity Act, and AI Act, it's also, there's a lot to be desired still. Okay, so the implementation of this narrative is not yet there. Regulation, piloting, thinking, capacity, skills, it's not there.
Right.
So we still have a lot of job to do. And I would like to comment on one thing that Natalia said, and then also else, and that is, can we move? So digital gives us bigger power than automating EPR scheme registrations. Let's dream a little beyond that and go from EPR, so to producers' ownership. So in a way, to circular business models. For me, DPP is of course very good for consumers to get trusted and correct information. It's very much about consumers. It's very much about market authorities to do their job with respect to fair access to market. It's very much about customs to do the automatic check, because customs are actually looking at now, how do we do registry of DPP? So they actually, at the borders, we automatically check that if that product has DPP and therefore has all the information according to eco-design criteria. All that is important. For me, the most important is that DPP will enable transition of the businesses from selling materials and, from kind of a quantity-based business models to sustainable business models. For example, product as a service, which means going from EPR to, paying for externalities and things like that, to owning the product, to sell service, not the product, and make money based on services, which are much more
carpooling example.
Carpooling example, car sharing for example, but it can be for washing machines, it can be for furniture, it can be for anything. That is actually the ultimate goal for me with DPP.
Right. How does this business model sound to you, Alison?
It's a very triggering question because it comes with a lot of implications for consumers. There's certainly space for product as a service. But for us, I mean, when we look at product as a service now, and in the end, you need to make the balance as a consumer, what it costs and how long you can use a product. It's not always that beneficial right now. In the end, it will end up consumers with paying more for the use of a product than actually buying it. And that shouldn't be a problem as long as the product can last long. And that's the issue here. Currently, I mean, products fail way too fast. I mean, it's not normal that after 5 years, you would need to replace a washing machine. And you can then say, okay, let's rent a washing machine instead of buying it. But if you make the balance, in terms of environmental impact and the cost for consumers, for us, still the better thing would be that they can buy a washing machine that can last again for 20 years, like it used to do when my grandmother had a washing machine. Because in the end, also the products that you rent as a service will need to last longer. And for us, this is one of the core issues that we need to consider also when reflecting on product as a service. Early obsolescence is still a major problem. I know this commission has taken some, and we have been pushing a lot on this as well. It comes also with digital implications because lots is related to software updates. I mean, with just a software update, products could last longer, but they need to be there. So for us, this is really the core issue to look at first, make sure that these products last longer, and then we can make the balance, like how much will it cost consumers compared to the sustainability impact. But I think with products that we have now on the market, we're not there yet.
Can I quickly?
Sure, absolutely.
What would incentivize a producer to make his product last longer? If they use it in a product as a service scenario, or if they sell it? What would incentivize them to make it last longer? Do you think?
So, you know, I mean,
The question is that by default, if I sell, I want to buy every 2 years new model. If I use that model and make money on how to use it, by default, I'll make it that it'll never break because I want you to keep it as long as possible. So the same washing machines will be built completely differently if it's for rent, because I don't want to come to your house every 2 years to fix it. I will make sure that I don't need to go, so my profit goes up.
it's a bit of I mean, in that reason, you would say consumers just need to pay more in the long run for producers to be able to deliver our more sustainable products. And indeed, it could be an incentive, you know,
Yeah.
consumers get more profit if I produce something more sustainable. But it's a bit the other way around. I mean, actually, producers should be obliged by legislation, eco-design, for
Right.
example, to produce longer lasting products for consumers. It's a bit the other way around. I mean, it's a bit difficult to use merely consumers and the economic benefit they can bring to producers to create more sustainability. It should be the other way around. I mean, producers should be able to deliver more sustainable products to consumers. And I do believe there's a market in there. Because if, as a producer, you can differentiate yourself as saying, look, my product, I guarantee you, it will not last 5 years, it will last 10 years, well, then you will get an economic benefit from consumers because they are really looking for longer lasting products. And when you make the calculation, okay, I pay a little bit more in the beginning, but I'm sure I can keep my product for 10, 20 years. I'm sure it can be repaired. Then you have an economic benefit, and it's also a market that needs to play there. And it's really baffling to me that not that many producers have jumped on this opportunity to distinguish themselves on sustainability. And I hope with current legislation that is being introduced, it will be a game changer.
That's the goal of eco-design,
Yeah.
to go that way.
Yeah.
But that's sometimes not enough.
Yeah.
The other thing, the bigger picture is that if we are in capitalist system, but we are not really doing it right in a way that there are capitals that are not valued. So we do value a lot of financial capital, labor capital somehow, but the natural capital we don't. So if we start really valuing it, you will see that selling things will be much more expensive, because the materials will have to be taxed, the CO2 or whatever, and it'll become, because of the geopolitical struggles for materials, the price will come. So the price of materials will go up as well. So then ultimately we want to make sure that the most sustainable product is the cheapest. That's for me the goal. That sustainability has to be the cheaper option than alternative. If we don't get there, it'll never be. We will never make it.
Where we go to Natalie's eco-modulation idea that there is somehow a way to actually incentivize or penalize products that are less environmental and incentivize those that are more environmental. I think to me also, I understand the logic of these product as service systems, that the incentive would actually work also for the benefit of the consumers, because indeed the longer lasting you make your product, the cheaper you're able to offer it, because there will be a competition of price on the service as well, I guess, between the companies. So there may be ways to work that, but let me move a bit to Colo here. So a lot of issues here that have been exchanged. How does it? So first question: if one thinks of these ideas that are on the table that have been mentioned from the viewpoint as policies, how do you see them resonating with the latest WTO kind of the discussions that you just mentioned? Do you see any specific points that you might wish to raise? And did you have yourself questions towards us, perhaps to the speakers here on the topics raised?
Exactly. I actually did have a question/comment because obviously my point of view is always from a cross-border perspective and not internal. And I think one of the things that we should consider, and that's why I sort of focus my presentation on services, is that perhaps not so distant future, which is already happening now, the products that, of course, we want to adapt and make them, environmentally compliant, are going to move away from just being washing machines to being, product as a service that is, sustained by a service, meaning that there will be AI or whatever digitalization behind it, where you're optimizing, the ability of the washing machine to work optimally all the time in terms of water, in terms of energy, et cetera, et cetera. And that might be a device that is, sold by a producer who's outside of the EU, for example. And so there's a constant flow of service of data, and probably going forward, that would be the value of the device. And I think when you're talking about how do you then manage that from a cross-border perspective, things like, data laws, data localization, non-discrimination, market access start to matter. And so obviously in the design of policies in the EU, that's obviously important because not everything can be sourced and produced within the EU's borders. A lot of the minerals, a lot of the products are just not going to be made in the EU. And so on a policy level, there always has to be discussion like how do these devices then and how would they work once they're imported, or once they are imported, the service that's going to go back and forth between the device and the manufacturer, or whichever company that's going to run the service from another country in the world. And so I just wanted to throw those types of consideration on the table and hear your perspectives on that as well.
Any thoughts on that?
This is excellent point because everything will become a service one way or the other, because even smart machines are from fridges to washing machines, to cars, to everything we will do will be kind of, there will be data flow. So Data Act is trying to, Data Act and Data Governance Act are trying to tackle that. But the international dimension still needs international players to play with it. So this Data Act is for EU, but we need this type of Data Governance Act to become globally, and WTO is the place to be. So this joint initiative of e-commerce, I had some people actually talking to me. It's us as a commission, but there are many member states that have their ideas that would like commission to take up, because we are sitting in this committee. And we see resistance from developing countries because often it's seen that there's a lot of burden and reporting, and so it's not, we are not on the same page globally. I see that there's a lot of different understanding globally on what it means to be fair and to be open to data flows.
Yeah.
I think it's very complex because then you start hitting against much bigger walls, like depending where literally the service is coming from. Because I think in certain cases, you could justify that the US would be okay, but not China. I mean, I think that'll come up a lot. But at the same time, it comes up against the protectionism wall again, and the idea of trying to build EU champions, and so preventing also non-EU companies from being able to hold the data, which I think then gets complex if you're looking at a global economy. And I think to the point that Hoda was making, there are opportunities as well within the WTO to find governance models that'll work to enable these services to cross borders, which has been the case with the e-commerce. Then we need to make sure that that's done in a way that doesn't exclude certain players, but also doesn't create any safety concerns. And I know this is very complex in the current political context, especially.
We see that in data spaces. I mean, I don't know if you follow, but for me, it's very strange triangle, the digital product passport, the data space, what we do in data spaces, and the green claims and the information needed there. So kind of Bermuda's triangle, people are trying to struggle. You get lost. Once you go into details of green claims, data space, DPP, you get very easily lost. So how it's gonna work, how all these data requirements will fit DPP and be in charge, and support green claims.
Yes,
at a global level.
Exactly. That's, I guess, what Colo was underlining, and what I'm sure Amazon would be happy to see. So what do you see as the prospect of actually getting into global standards or agreement? Because what one sees, whether one picks the circular economy related, product related issues such as eco design, or the data flows that are underneath it, due to the life cycles that are global and reach across many borders, it seems obvious that there will be some commonalities that are needed. It would be in a way in everybody's benefit, but then the geopolitical context is pushing in exactly the opposite direction. So in a way, the forces of the commerce and of consumers and supply and demand, I guess, are opposed some ways to the current scenario. But I don't know how do you see, for example, the digital product passport discussions having some international links? And then, Kolo, how do you see it from if you go a bit deeper into the practical discussions at the WTO level on the topics you mentioned, do you see that there is development being made? You mentioned environmental goods, for example, that's been a bit stalled for a long time, but how do you also see the prospects of actually moving on a global level on the topics that you just mentioned yourself?
Yeah, so I'll just sort of address the environmental goods and sort of other things. I mean, that degree, the agreement on that just was very sort of close, and then it just fell apart in the end. And I think just, from recent discussions that I've had and sort of forums that I've attended, there's a lot of appetite to take that up and to upgrade it and bring into the environmental sort of goods that are digital as well. And I think that is a huge opportunity. There's actually right now at the WTO such a huge push on sustainability. It's actually unbelievable, circular, plastic, whatever it is. And so I think this is a topic that is very hot at the WTO. And I think it's really the EU as, in my opinion, the sustainability champion, who is championing a lot of things at the WTO indeed, including this e-commerce JI, which, the EU was very active at the beginning at sort of getting it off the ground. This is where I think, the EU really has a great place to play. I think a lot of issue that we were talking about with developments is me, working with some developing countries is really the issue of capacity. I know at the beginning when CBAM came up, there was really an uproar on the side of developing countries because they just felt like, how are we going to manage all of this? And I think really going forward, there has to be some sort of, I guess, consultation mechanism or whatever it is, because it's not just the developing countries, but other countries who may not agree with the way that the CBAM will operate might bring a dispute, going forward. Unfortunately or fortunately now, I think nobody has the courage to start bringing disputes on environmental and sustainability issues, because we all know that this is a critical part of our world going forward. So maybe, we're safe for now, but as you said, the geopolitics of it might, upset somebody and somebody might, try and bring down a measure that is really for a good cause that would really bring, positive in externalities for all, but because that one country might feel discriminated against, that's an issue going forward. But essentially in the JI, and to be honest with you, I'm just going to give you my little bit of my opinion. The issues that are left on the table right now are quite slender. And I think, we need to start thinking about how do we bring back the data issues? How do we bring back data localization? How, because going forward, using, digital as an enabler to environmental, address environmental issues, we cannot do this if there's data localization in every other country. It's not going to happen. Yeah. And so I think we need to move away from the silos and start thinking about how do we, together solve these issues.
Very good. Natalie, you wanted to.
I guess it was actually a question also to Holo, because I was just curious to hear your views as well about the international reception or the international reactions to the DPP, because it's such a powerful tool potentially also for, of course, tracing supply chains and trying to green supply chains. But I was curious to hear from the WTO perspective whether this has come up against any concerns, or if it's only seen as potentially amazing tool that we could use.
Yeah, I mean, right now, as of yet, there are no, sort of official trade concerns that have been raised in the committees in the last of my sort of research. But they could be going forward because, the AI Act was raised in the committees. And I know sort of this Green Deal measures that are coming, you know, hot and heavy, do raise concerns. I think no country, and I'm not a WTO official, I'm not speaking about for the WTO or anything like that. It's just really my observation. I think a lot of countries agree that all of these are necessary, and I think a lot of countries sort of support the EU and support the EU's really strong stance on ensuring that you know, we have a planet in the future. But I think a lot of concern is just on application of it, on compliance, on cost of compliance, and on, you know, how especially smaller, you know, manufacturers or smaller SMEs will be able to cope. But yeah, I mean, essentially, I think all of this is great. And it seems like if challenged, you know, there are exceptions at the WTO. You know, there might be, you know, a challenge going back saying maybe tweak this, tweak that, this doesn't work. This seems to discriminate in favor of these countries and not the others. But essentially, you know, a well-balanced measure will always sort of be found to be, you know, justifiable under the agreements.
Very good.
I see, Carlos, so for you to know, I see the potential of a new market of DPP as a service providers, especially for SMEs that have no clue how to put all these things together.
Yeah.
So, and they by default will have to be only focused on providing this service, not to use the data for other purposes, which is already part of ESPR. So that's legally already embedded there. And if we can do it right, we can have a vibrant market of many companies competing to have it as a very small price. And with that, you can actually do many other things. As a provider of DPP, you can also do reporting, business intelligence, you know, supply chain management. There are many other things that IT can come to help SMEs, so they don't have to develop that capacity. There's no way they will ever develop such capacity. So we will have to make sure that we provide services that are affordable, you know, trusted, secure, and that's where WT will have to come as well at some point, because there will be a lot of data.
Yeah.
So there is a misunderstanding that DPP also deals with tracing, tracking supply chains. It is focused on a product at the moment, but it's being pulled apart by social requests, by, you know, the supply, the value chain requests all over the place. So it's difficult to kind of keep it focused and make it work before it can actually put and be surrounded by voluntary data that can do many other things. But once the system is there for some data, the voluntary data can come in and it can be used as a system for many other things. But we just need to make sure that we launch it, you know, correctly.
And that, indeed, and that's where the policy and private interests are actually.
And one more thing, there is a lot of work that we do in the context of EU taxonomy, what IT can do, not only for climate, but also now for environmental, so water, circular economy, pollution, and others. Those type of services where we actually will develop the criteria could be used by WTO as well as, no, these type of services actually can have positive impact on sustainability and could be subject to whatever, you know, exemptions or agreements. Yeah.
I mean, what I can say is that I think there's definitely scope for members to engage more with the Secretariat and the WTO. There's ongoing research on these things. I mean, and as I said, it's really a hot topic of interest. There's a lot of research at the WTO. The WTO keeps on issuing you know, research briefs, collaborating with organizations, and there's definitely, you know, sort of a need for countries like the EU to provide, you know, the information that is not publicly available, because not everybody is as specialized in doing this as EU companies, as EU legislators, et cetera. And so I think perhaps that's the scope, and, you know, sort of engage and you know, create committees in the WTO going forward to deal with specific topics, working groups. You know, they're working groups on various topics that are, you know, and it's not even to, you know, to get to a negotiation, but to really canvas the topics, you know, in a safe space with countries that are interested. Many submissions are made and brought up, and the works of those committees sometimes have, you know, led to, you know, sort of better things like the plastics you know, discussions that are, you know, really have gone through and really created some guidelines that are really tangible and usable. So I think it's really, I think, up to member states to engage the way that they do and they want. And if a member state like the EU has got obviously very huge interest in ensuring, the sustainability and the digital sustainability agenda is pushed forward, there's a lot of opportunity to engage.
Yeah. Did you also want to say something?
No, I just wanted to maybe take a step back and look again a bit at the bigger picture also with the upcoming mandate. And especially what you also mentioned, yes, it's about the affordability. I mean, we recently, ahead of the European elections, we run a large-scale survey on, how it is perceived, but also consumers' expectations for the future. And you see major concern, okay, climate change, it's still very top of mind. Consumers still care and they want to act on this. The wars, of course, are a major concern as well, but by far our number one is the cost of living crisis and inflation. And it really transcends also when you look at very concrete consumer demands. By far, our number one is access to affordable, sustainable goods, access to affordable, sustainable food, to affordable, sustainable mobility solutions, to affordable, sustainable housing solutions. So it really shows that this is going to be key. And it brings it a bit back to also a product as a service. It's a bit of the chicken or the egg. Do we play the game and do we make sure, knowing that for the moment it's the more expensive option for consumers? And do we take the time to let the market grow and compete? And maybe in the end it will become cheaper, or do we do it the other way around and do we make sure that the products last longer and are affordable? I also want to highlight another study that we did, and it's actually the affordability barometer. And for me, it was, I was really, well, not entirely surprised, but really a little bit shocked, because it showed that even in a relatively, rich country like Belgium, only 20% of consumers are able to put money aside still. So they have enough to survive. So that's the good thing, but there is little money left to thrive, which also means that everything that will come on top to buy of sustainable goods or services, it will not work for a large majority of consumers. And it's even worse in countries like Italy, Spain, and Portugal. So it's really an issue, this affordability. And this brings me back again to the competition discussion we had in the beginning. If we want affordable, sustainable goods, we need to create good competition. So it will be very important to look at markets to make sure that they are fair, internal market, but also external ones. And data flows indeed come in there. There are legitimate concerns about the data going to, blocks that might not be the most trustworthy ones. Then again, trade can really be a tool to fix this and to elevate this and raise standards, not only for Europe, but also for the other parts. It's really, it sounds easier than it is. You don't need to explain it. This is hugely challenging, but I really want to call, the trend of everyone, turning on itself and creating, Chinese block, Russian block, American, European blocks. It's based on legitimate concerns, but it also comes with a lot of risk. And here trade is really the tool to maybe, do it in a better way, in a right way, and to step over shadows and really use trade also, and digital trade with data flows to elevate it to the better. Yeah.
Let's see if, let's open now the floor to questions, and let's check first online if we have anybody from our online audience. That you can maybe just read it. You better read it. I don't have my glasses with me. So.
Yes. Barry, do you want to read out your question yourself? Otherwise, I can read it out. So greetings from Dublin, from Barry Finnegan. As of 2022, 18% of electricity produced in Ireland goes to power data centers. This is projected to rise to at least 30% by 2030, by which time 30% of the country's drinking water will go towards cooling data centers. Is there any support in the room for or belief in the prospect of the EU mandating data centers to A, be carbon neutral on site through perhaps the use of deep geothermal, and B, to use only recycled wastewater or desalinated seawater, and C, to internalize the cost of their contribution to triple crisis?
Yes, that's a big question. This is the cutting edge issue that we're dealing with today. So we have struggled even to see how can we measure what green data center is.
Yeah.
In the past, we had something called code of conduct. It was kind of fluffy. It was more best practices. Now we issued actually recently delegated what has to be measured. And Ireland is obliged as of September 24 to give us, and that will be the first time reporting, so it will be lenient, but as of 2025, very specific measures what the data centers are doing. So that's the public will, it's putting all the spotlight on the data centers because that's the number one infrastructure digital that is that has normally thought to be under control with respect to carbon increase, but because of AI, the last 2 years, everything went out of any norm. So it kind of went out of the trajectory we thought for. So there is privately that there's a climate neutral data center pact. So the private sector is self-regulating. But even the most, like the top of the class green data centers say, I will reuse 90% of the water. I will reuse, I will do 90% or total electricity is renewable, but that renewable maybe just, offsets it, renewable. So there are still big challenges because these promises cannot be fulfilled because there is not so much renewable that they want, and they cannot be the preferred buyer. I mean, they would buy everything renewable there if they could. So there are physical kind of limits to all the sustainability claims that we need to look at now. Another question there are, and it's kind of becoming a political issue. So there are some political parties say that we would have to actually see the purpose of these data centers. So they go down to saying that mining of Bitcoin should be forbidden. So they go down routes that are very interventional, which I don't think people even can separate these processes and say, yeah, I can forbid data mining for crypto. So, and there are other political parties that say, no, we have to do a more holistic kind of approach. So it becomes a political issue. Okay. But it is a newly worrying trend because of AI. Because suddenly all the limits of progression that we had in mind have been thrown into, have been reconsidered because one company just published that, we promised to be net zero, but actually the last 3 years we are 30% more on electricity and 40% more on water. Although 2 or 3 years ago, the promise was that they would be lower. They are much higher than they thought. So you see the companies themselves struggling.
I think, yes, I mean, I think I agree with you. I know I've seen this reports as well, but I think that there's also a need to shift the narrative slightly, because it's true, but when we're looking also at the competitiveness narrative, there's a question about, I mean, the digital revolution is going to happen, and there's a question about whether we want to be part of it as Europe or if we want to be aside, and so creating a context, particularly with the current energy system, where we've got enough green energy, a stable and reliable energy system where the grids are upgraded to actually accommodate digital services, and for me should be a bigger priority than trying to quash them, because otherwise you miss the boat.
And that's my punchline. Just to finish, what I wanted to say is that if you focus on making digital green, then the better is to do nothing. That's the greenest option. But we cannot, because there are other two dimensions of sustainability, economic and social. Digital enabled 30% of Belgians not to lose their jobs during COVID. That's, you cannot come, because what some people are so keen about the green that they forget the social impact. And then you have people on the street. Okay, so there is optimization of digital against all three dimensions. So the best way to look at digital is to think about it as net effect. If the net effect is positive, let it grow as a footprint, because there is a multiple leverage on the handprint. So the policy narrative should be, don't look at only the green, because that's easy to measure. Now we have methods to also measure handprint. let's change the narrative to look at digital as what is its net footprint. If the net footprint starts hovering towards negative, then we may need to take political decisions about what digital is, what is the purpose of digital.
Yeah.
But if the net is positive, then okay, if it rises, because it definitely cuts much more on some other fronts, transport, energy, products, agriculture, somewhere else. But that has to be measurable and evidence has to be there.
Yeah. What is interesting here, of course, is that if we think of CBAM or other things which are actually there to prevent that the more wasteful industries then move elsewhere to do that, I guess in a data economy which is very much international, the same may happen, and the servers which may be here
That's
and therefore
happening
there
already.
will actually be elsewhere, and then maybe even more polluting, and where we don't have the rules in place. So I don't know what kind of a CBAM we need then for actually for the data sector to maintain what is here. The servers, yeah, I don't know, servers all around the world, I'm sure. So this is, and we go back to the data flows as well.
Yeah,
Issue as well.
exactly.
So things
Exactly.
things are intertwined in multiple dimensions.
And competitiveness.
I mean, there's no,
As well.
yeah, but there's no discussion. This is challenging. Yeah? I mean, even if the net balance is still positive, I mean, it's a no-brainer that there should be more done to make data centers sustainable. I mean, banning or intervening. I mean, you can ask questions whether some developments of AI are really, needed or beneficial. There's a lot of frivolity as well, but I mean, I agree. It's extremely difficult to intervene in that. So it should be a no-brainer that there needs to be done more to make these data centers more sustainable.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of innovation. I mean, these data centers, they have the brains, they have the capabilities. For sure, they can use their innovation also to make themselves more sustainable. So I think it's a no-brainer that more needs to be done there.
Yeah, sure.
And maybe on a more triggering question, and I don't want to end in this way, but it also puts responsibility on the bigger picture. We started by talking about e-commerce. E-commerce is digital trade by definition, and it's great that more is being done to make retailers more sustainable, producer liabilities, but also I think there's also a huge challenge for the who offer e-commerce as a whole as well, and it has been a little bit left off the hook in the Green Deal. There were separate legislations affecting on it, but I think also for the next mandate, there will be a huge importance to also look at e-commerce and what can be done to make it more sustainable as a whole. Transport the last mile, but also making sure products are not being destroyed anymore. I mean, it's good to work on, the producers and the retailers, but also I think there's a responsibility for the platforms there as well. Yeah,
I think, we agree with which is also why we have a net zero goal, because we do see that we have a responsibility, and the interesting element of e-commerce is that it is such a big scale, and it's so many different types of business that if we can decarbonize, then that the transport sector can decarbonize, the retail sector can decarbonize, products can decarbonize, because if Amazon is doing it, then we're doing it across all these sectors, and so it also shows what other sectors can do. So I think we agree with this, and we've been very vocal on the need to have very strong targets, for instance, for CO2 reductions of trucks and of vans, because it helps us make sure that we've got the infrastructure on the road so that we can buy more electric vehicles and decarbonize faster.